Today we'll be explaining a 2002 American romantic comedy film, Brown Sugar. The movie's first scene portrays the seminal childhood moment of two street best friends, Sydney and Dre. Starting the day they discovered hip-hop on a New York street corner, Sydney begins to narrate her life-changing experience after experiencing two professional rappers battle against each other. That was the day she truly and deeply fell in love with hip-hop. Her and her best friend in the whole world, Dre. 20 years later, Sydney has just been appointed the editor-in-chief of hip-hop working for XXL magazine. Now we meet Andrew Ellis, grown-up Dre, an A&R for a record label called Millennium Records. Sydney decides to reunite at a party with her best friend after a long period of working. The two are happy to finally see each other. Dre introduces Sydney to Reese, a successful entertainment attorney, the woman he had fallen in love with over a short period of time. After Reese leaves the gathering, Dre revealed he was going to propose to Reese tonight. Sydney is so happy for him, although she scolds him for jumping into marriage after knowing Reese for only a few months. Reese invites Sydney to her bridal tea shower. In the shower game, where the winner was determined by whoever got personal questions related to the groom right, Sydney gets every question right, causing guests to be suspicious. When it's time to open the gifts, Sydney's gift to Reese is something we should use our imaginations. However, the girls laugh about it. Afterwards, Sydney tells Dre how embarrassed she was when Reese opened her present, which was bought by her cousin, Francine. Later on, Dre suggested Sydney come with him to sign a new MC recruit for his record label, Anton Bitchen, aka Cavi. They see Cavi's talent on stage and Dre is impressed. However, Cavi isn't interested in signing with Dre's record label because he doesn't like the music they produce. That's when we see two whack rappers reveal to Dre they were just signed to his record label yesterday. The following morning, Dre goes back to question his boss for signing them. However, the only thing his boss cares about is his pockets and not entirely good music. Dre goes over to Sydney's to explain to her how he felt. His boss wasn't making it possible for him to actually put good music out there, the one thing he so much loved doing. Now he's stuck with trying to deepen his record label's pocket instead of chasing his dreams. Sydney pulls him closer and gives him a warm hug, followed by a kiss on the forehead, then a kiss on the cheek, then another hesitant kiss on the mouth. Dre kisses back and Sydney lets go of her towel, but she soon realized what she was doing was wrong, so she had to stop immediately. An intense, awkward moment filled the atmosphere afterwards. After realizing what just happened, Dre rushes out immediately, whereas Sydney facepalms herself. The next day, it's Dre's wedding. Sydney's cousin Francine detects the brief eye contact between Dre and Sydney. She immediately deduces the romantic tension between them and encourages Sydney to object when the Reverend Father asked, though Sydney refused. As time goes by, Dre celebrates his marriage at work. Sydney joins a new gym and even goes out on new dates. A while later, Sydney goes to interview a rather handsome professional athlete, Kelby Dawson, an NBA star. Coincidentally, Dre and his wife run into her, and they run into his professional whack rappers. Dre's boss pushes him to work with the untalented but commercially viable rappers, forcing him to choose between his income and his love of hip-hop. He decides to quit and form his own label, focusing on bringing back the real hip-hop that his generation fell in love with. He meets Cavi, the MC from the other night, in a cab. Turns out Cavi was a rapper at night, cab driver by day. Cavi is the first person Dre told he quit his job. Cavi jokes about Dre leaving. Dre's feelings are hurt and tells him to pull over. He is on his way to meet Sydney when he sees the load of flowers Kelby sent to her in request for a date. Later, the two take a break at a park where they recall the good memories of hip-hop they grew up with back in the day. After a while, Dre tells Sydney he quit his job and he was working on starting a new record label. As his #1 friend in the world and fan, Sydney is happy for him no matter what and gives him a check as a part of his capital. Dre goes home and tries to explain to his wife he quit his job. But Reese doesn't take it easy because as far as she is concerned, he was supposed to consult her before he took action. Dre tries to make her understand but somehow worsens the case when he mentions Sydney was helping with some funds. Hearing that Sydney knew about it didn't make his situation better. Reese gets annoyed and leaves. Meanwhile, Sydney is having a wonderful date with Kelby. In the middle of the night, Dre calls Sydney to tell him how her date went. Sydney replies it was going great, and Kelby even cooked for her. She was even in the middle of making coffee. However, Dre totally disagrees with her making coffee and tells her Kelby just wanted to have her for the night. He claimed that it was a killer card men used to get ladies. Although Sydney doesn't care, because whatever game Kelby played it was working well, hence hanging up. Dre desperately whispers Sydney's name loud enough for Reese to come out from the bedroom. The next day Dre shows up at Kavvy's place of work. He convinces Kavy to come work for him, since he'd be starting a record label. Meanwhile at the gym, Sydney witnesses some guy flirting with Reese. The both of them get grouped together to work out. As they throw punches, Reese let out her frustration concerning Dre's friendship with Sydney and his love of good hip-hop that made him quit his job. Sydney tries to make her understand hip-hop meant everything to Dre, but by doing so they drew attention to themselves. Reese summarizes Sydney was in love with Dre before walking out on her. He throws a party to celebrate the success of his record label and the efforts of his workers, also thanking Sydney personally. After his toast, Kelby uses the opportunity to propose to Sydney and she agrees. Later, Dre comes in to remind Sydney she couldn't go ahead with marrying Kelby. However, Sydney doesn't agree with him. Dre doesn't stop with his incessant talking. It almost seemed like he was jealous because Sydney was getting married to Kelby. Sydney tells him to be happy for her like she has been happy for him. Dre soon realized his mistakes and apologized. Sydney forgives him and they hug it out. Unbeknownst to them, their partners are watching their actions. Sydney begins to have doubts about Kelby when she discovers that he doesn't read her articles. Later, Sydney visits Dre working in his studio. Dre gets a message intended for Reese from Richard. He immediately understood his wife was up to something, so he dragged Sydney with him. The both of them catch Reese on a date with another guy. Dre gets upset and confronts Reese in her date. When Dre's about to make a scene, Sydney pulls him by his ears out of the restaurant. They go back to Sydney's house. Dre is partly heartbroken by Reese's actions. He subtly starts sharing his feelings for Sydney. They both kiss, and their intimacy leads to a night of shared passion. As soon as they were done, Sydney starts regretting their intimate coupling. It could ruin their friendship, and most importantly, Dre was married, and she just got engaged. She goes back to meet our superstar NBA player and pretends like nothing happened. A couple days later, Dre and Kavy submit Kavy's first single to a popular radio station, Hot 97. Later, Sydney discovers his record track and goes to confront Dre because she wouldn't be able to do a reveal for him due to the fact that she gave him money to start the record label. Dre doesn't see anything wrong with it. In fact, he tried to change the subject of the matter, which was hip-hop, to how they both felt inside. He almost rubs lips with Sydney's, but this time she struggles to escape Dre and told him what she wanted was final. Reese calls Dre to apologize to him and try to make things work out between them. But Dre told her she crossed the line when she went out with Richard, and deep down she knew their relationship couldn't work out anymore. Meanwhile, Sydney meets up with Kelby. They were supposed to see a movie, but Sydney came in late, making Kelby a bit upset about it. Sydney explains the reason for her lateness, but Kelby doesn't seem to mind and just keeps walking. Soon he stops and tells her he knew she didn't want to get married, saying he knows she loved Dre more than she loved him. After everything going on between her and Dre, she finally accepts the fact she is not prepared to marry Kelby. She calls off the engagement by apologizing and returning Kelby's ring to him. She then cried and walked away. Upon searching for Dre, she sees Reese and Dre in a parting embrace, where they seemed like they were about to kiss. She misconstrues this as something more in tears. Dre goes back to Hot 97, the radio station, and demands that they put his record label track on rotation, and if they didn't put it on rotation, he was going to come by every week till they put it on rotation. Dre goes outside and announces the big news to Kavy. They celebrate together and go home to wait for the track to play. The both of them start to joke around when they hear Sydney being interviewed over the radio. Dre calls the radio at that point and begins to ask Sydney a few questions, pretending to be a regular fan of hers. His question followed what time she fell in love with music. On Sydney's first attempt, she gets it wrong, but on her second attempt, she realized it was Dre calling. She confesses her love to Dre. Meanwhile, Dre already used Kavy's taxi to drive down to the radio station. While Sydney is answering the phone, Dre shows up from the entrance and confesses how much he loved her since the first date he saw her. Meanwhile, in the production booth, Kavy stumbles in trying to ask Francine out again. She recognizes their attraction and asks him out on a date. Afterwards, the film ends with Kavy's song playing in the same park where Dre and Sydney's love of hip-hop truly began.